In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding setTimeout within JavaScript. We are first going to go over just an overview of how it works. Then we're going to dive into some examples to give you a better understanding of how it works. And then we're going to touch on a very common and also tricky interview question when it comes to the setTimeout method. So first things first here, what is just kind of an overview of how it works? Well, setTimeout is a global method within JavaScript that exists on the window object. It takes two arguments. The first is going to be a function, and then the second argument is going to be a certain amount of time. And you're going to specify this time in milliseconds. And then once that specific amount of time has elapsed, the setTimeout function will then run your first argument, your passed in function. Okay, so setTimeout, it's a global function that will run a function after a specified amount of time. Now, the setTimeout method, it also returns one value, and that is going to be an ID. And you can then use this ID to then clear your timeout later in your program. And you can do that using the global clear timeout method that also exists. Now, with the setTimeout method, it only runs your passed in function once the delay expires. If you want to run a function multiple times, then a better method to use might be something like the setInterval method, but I'll cover that in future videos, okay? So let's go over some examples of using this method. So in the first example here, this is just going to be a very kind of straightforward example in which I have the setTimeout method here, and the setTimeout method, it's a global method, so I can use this for free within JavaScript. I don't need to create this anywhere. It actually exists on the window object, but I don't need to specify the window object here. I don't need to call window.setTimeout. You could, but you can just call setTimeout straight away, and JavaScript will implicitly understand that you're calling window.setTimeout. All right, and then like I said in my overview, it takes two arguments. The first is going to be a function, and then the second is going to be a certain amount of time. And this time is specified in milliseconds. So setTimeout, it's going to run this function here after 2000 milliseconds have passed, or 2 seconds. And then as you can see here, I have a function called greeting, and all it does is console log hello. So if I run my function here, you're going to see that after about a delay of 2 seconds here, I get hello console logged to my output. Now, what if you want to pass arguments to your first function that you pass in? Well, in this example here, I can't do something like, put parentheses on this and then pass in some argument, because that's immediately going to call my function when I'm defining setTimeout here. I'm not just passing a function reference here. And that's what setTimeout needs. It needs me to pass a function reference. I shouldn't just call a function right away in this first argument of setTimeout. So if I can't do this, how do I pass arguments? Well, it's a very similar way in which you would pass arguments for other callback functions throughout JavaScript. So what you can actually do is you can pass an inline function to setTimeout to pass an argument. So here in this example, I have a function called greeting, just like before, but now it takes one argument, and this is going to be name. And then I'm just going to console log hello, and then I use a template string here and plug in the name. All right, so it's going to say hello to whatever name I pass into greeting. So to call this with setTimeout, I can pass an inline function to setTimeout here. So this is an inline anonymous arrow function here that I create. And what I'm going to do within this inline function is I'm going to call my greeting function with my passed in argument of Ryan. And this is okay to do because this inline function, I am just passing a reference to this inline function. I am not calling this greeting function here right away. I'm just passing in a function that when setTimeout calls this function, it's going to call this greeting function with my passed in argument. So if I run this here, you're going to see after 2 seconds, I get hello Ryan outputted to my console. Now, as I mentioned in my overview, the setTimeout function, it also returns an ID. And this ID can be used to clear your timeouts. And you can use the clear timeout method and pass in your ID to do this. So here I have the same function defined, function greeting, that just says hello to some name. And then on line 46, I call my setTimeout function just like I do before, passing in an inline function that calls my greeting component after 2000 milliseconds, but the setTimeout method, it's going to return an ID. And then I can use this ID to then clear this timeout. So here on line 48, I use the clear timeout method, and this is also a method that exists on the window object, but I don't need to explicitly say window.clearTimeout. I can just use this method straight away, and JavaScript implicitly knows I'm calling the window.clearTimeout method. And to this method, I can pass my ID argument. And what this is going to do, it's going to clear the timeout of whatever ID I pass into it. So in this example here, you're going to see that, okay, I set up this timeout, but it's going to immediately come to this line 48 here after it sets my timeout, and it's going to clear my timeout before it has a chance to run my setTimeout function. So it's actually never going to run this function. So if I run this here, you see I get nothing outputted to my console because I clear my timeout before this 2000 milliseconds has passed. So you can clear your timeouts using the return value of setTimeout, which is an ID, and then you can pass that ID to clear timeout, and that will effectively remove the timeout that you have set, and it will not run that function if you clear that timeout before the passed in function has a chance to run. Now, let's cover one very common interview question. And this all comes back to the fact that the setTimeout method within JavaScript is asynchronous. And one part of this asynchronous behavior of the setTimeout method is that no matter what, once you set a timeout to run after a certain amount of time, JavaScript is going to push this function to something called a task queue. And functions that are put on the task queue, they are not going to run until all of your synchronous code has completed. So JavaScript also has something called an event loop. And the event loop, it's going to continuously check, okay, do I have anything in my task queue? And is all my synchronous code completed? Is my main call stack of all my synchronous code, is that empty? If yes, then the event loop is going to grab something from the task queue and it's going to run that function. And the event loop just kind of continuously checks, okay, is all synchronous code completed? If not, keep running synchronous code. If yes, check if I have any functions on my task queue. If I do, then run one of those functions. Push that onto the main call stack and run that. And then it kind of keeps doing this check. But it's important to remember that any function that is an asynchronous function that's pushed to the task queue, like setTimeout is, it's only going to run after all of your synchronous code has completed. And that is irregardless of what you placed as the milliseconds to the setTimeout method. So even if you pass 0 milliseconds to the setTimeout method, it's still going to get pushed to the task queue, and the event loop is not going to push that task onto the main call stack until all synchronous code is completed, all of your synchronous code. It could be a super long for loop. It doesn't matter. The function passed in is not going to be pushed onto your main call stack to run until all of your synchronous code has completed. So in this example here, it's a very common interview question that kind of tests your knowledge of the event loop and the task queue, in which on line 52, I console log 1. And then here on line 54, I set a timeout, I pass in an inline function, and then this function, it's going to console log 2. And then as my second argument, I pass in 0 milliseconds. So no time. And then here on line 56, I console log 3. And the interview question is, okay, what order do you think that these console logs are going to occur? Well, if I run this function here, you're going to see that I get 1, 3, and 2. Okay, that can be a little bit tricky because I set a timeout for 0 milliseconds. So one might think that this console log, it's just going to run right away. It's going to run immediately. However, like I was explaining before, the setTimeout method, it is an asynchronous method within JavaScript. So this function that's passed in here, no matter what you place as a time here, this function is going to be put on to your task queue. And the task queue methods, they are not going to run until all of your synchronous code is completed. So an overview of how this works is JavaScript's going to run line by line synchronously down your code. It's going to hit line 52. It's going to console log 1. Then it's going to hit line 54. And what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, setTimeout, it's an asynchronous method. We're going to put this method into the task queue here, and then we are going to run this method after this time has elapsed and once the main call stack has finished and all synchronous code has completed. So this function is going to be pushed onto the task queue, and then we're going to finish running all synchronous code within this program before we check, okay, is my timeout completed and should I run this function? So then JavaScript's going to continue running all synchronous code. It's going to hit line 56 here. It's going to cancel log 3. And then once my main call stack is completed, then the event loop is going to be like, okay, all synchronous code is completed. Do I have any tasks to run that exist on my task queue? Well, yes, you will have this task and your set timeout is going to be completed because you set it for 0 milliseconds. So you are going to indeed run this function here. All right. So a very common interview question there. And it's important to understand that set timeout functions, they are going to be placed on the task queue. And no matter what you set as a time for those, they're not going to be run until all of your synchronous code has completed, because the event loop is not going to push them onto the main call stack until all synchronous code has completed. Okay. Now, as mentioned earlier, I am going to cover set interval in future videos, so stay tuned for that. Hopefully you took something away from this video and learned a bunch about set timeout, and hopefully you passed this interview question, and I will see you in that next one.